welcome to Macros with Mythili, our weekly program where we take a hard look at all the major macroeconomic issues and developments in India and overseas. Well, with all eyes on the Modi government as it completes its first year in office, joining me from Washington is Eswar Prasad Tolani, Senior Professor of Trade Policy, Cornell University, and Senior Fellow, Brookings Institution, to give us his idea of the hits and misses of the Modi government as well as his reading of global economic cues. Welcome to the show, Eswar. It has been 6 months since we had you last on the show and a year since the Modi government took over. At that time, expectations ran sky high, both in India and overseas. Today, in India at least, there's been a general sense that we need to tone down our expectations. Is that a view shared by the West as well?
Certainly the euphoria about India's economic performance once Mr. Modi was elected has quieted down a bit. There was a sense that there might be a huge momentum on reforms early in his term. That did not happen. I think there's been slow but positive progress. And initially, especially because India, among the emerging markets, seemed to be the one country with a positive growth momentum, was seen very favorably by international investors. That sense of excitement has also cooled down a little bit, partly because there is a sense that the reforms have slowed down. There is also a sense that the very high growth expectations for India may have to be muted a little bit. And a lot of capital had flown in earlier. So now I think there is more of a wait-and-see attitude. So I'd say that among the emerging markets, there is still a fairly positive attitude about India. But it's certainly been tempered by the fact that the reforms have been progressing rather slowly. And in terms of the growth performance, of course, there is a fair degree of uncertainty in the statistics, but also the economic momentum, while positive, doesn't seem to be as robust as one might like to see.
Which aspects of the macroeconomic scenario do you feel are the most discouraging, and which are the ones that are more encouraging?
No, at one level, what is most encouraging, of course, is that the external circumstances have all been largely in India's favor. The fact that we've had a fair amount of capital inflows over the last year because of the positive views of the Indian economy, plus, of course, the decline in oil prices, which has certainly been very helpful for India in terms of bringing down the current account deficit, in terms of reducing fiscal expenditures, and helping to moderate inflation. All of this has been very good. And certainly the fact that we've had continuing financial market reforms, including the financial inclusion program that Mr. Modi and Governor Rajan of the RBI have been pushing forward quite aggressively, is certainly a positive sign. The fact that the macroeconomic policies seem to be in good shape, in particular the fact that inflation seems to have moderated quite a bit, and the government is supporting the RBI's fight against inflation, plus the fact that there is still a reasonable amount of fiscal discipline, although the slight increase in the deficit that we saw in the last budget was done for the right reasons, the increase in infrastructure spending. That's all seen as very good. But the big question is whether there is going to be momentum on the deep-rooted reforms that India really needs. And we all know the list of things that needs to be done. We need to deal with the very restrictive labor market. Bureaucracy and red tape still remain a problem. Infrastructure is still a concern. And although this government has indicated its intention to continue with fiscal discipline, the high debt level is still potentially a problem, although somewhat less so in this global low interest rate environment. But the real concern is about the big reforms. And now with many reforms like the GST and the land reforms losing momentum, I think that is the real concern, whether India, once the macroeconomic stability is there, can use that as a launching pad for the big structural reforms the country needs for its growth push.
Eswar, you spoke of a number of areas where we are in better shape, and that is undoubtedly true. But should one credit the government or Lady Luck for that?
It's been a mix of good policies and good luck. Certainly, the fact that the external circumstances are very favorable to India, both with the global low interest rate environment and the low oil prices, that has certainly helped a great deal. And many export-led economies are, of course, in a vulnerable position right now because external demand is very weak. But given that India is not that dependent on exports, it's not been much of a hit for India. So certainly all of that has been very lucky, but it still takes good policies to be able to make use of that luck. And I think in that sense, the fact that the Modi government has been pushing forward on reforms, albeit very slowly, and has given the RBI a lot of support in its fight against inflation and is trying to maintain fiscal discipline. All of these, I think, have helped India take advantage. Now, whether India is taking sufficient advantage of this very positive environment, both domestically and externally, to push forward with these big reforms, that remains the big question. And the fact that we don't have a clear answer to that question, I think, is what is making international investors and a number of analysts quite nervous about India at the moment.
So is economic revival being held hostage to politics?
Now, the Modi government has been in office for a year, and the government was elected with a big mandate, but still, the government doesn't have an entirely free hand, of course, because there are political constraints in the upper house and at the various state levels. So my sense is that politics is certainly hampering what the Modi government can do. There are many policies that the previous government had been advocating for that now that it is in opposition, it seems to be somewhat less enthusiastic about. But I think from the point of view of the governing party, the issue is always whether you can build up enough popular support behind reforms that can generate the right sort of momentum. And here again, my sense is that the Modi government is doing some of the right things. For instance, the financial inclusion program is very important, not just per se, but also because it gives the broader masses, especially in the rural areas, the sense that they have a chance of participating in any of the benefits from these reforms, rather than all the benefits going largely to the political and economic elite. So those sort of reforms that we don't hear that much about, I think are very important in terms of building a broad base of support for the reforms. And my own personal preference would have been for a bigger framework within which to encompass these reforms. If we take China as an example, they've been very successful at reforms, not only because they have the sort of government they do and are willing to push forward very aggressively with reforms, but in each of their reform areas, they've managed to build up a framework where all the individual elements sort of feed in together. So for instance, now that the government is trying to make the Chinese currency, the renminbi, a big international currency, that's an important objective, but what they're trying to do under the framework of that is to do everything the domestic economy needs, like build up better financial markets, better regulatory structures, make the currency more flexible. So although Mr. Modi has indicated a reluctance to lay out a grand vision, I think a sense of where the country is going to go and how these individual reforms fit into a broader package can really help again in building a broader mass of support. So I hope that we will get much more momentum on these big ticket reforms, and it is going to require some political capital, which I hope Mr. Modi will be willing to expend in order to get these things done.
Well, Eswar, I'm afraid it's time for us to slip into a very short break, but please stay with us. We'll be back very soon. Welcome back. You're watching Macros with Mythili, and we're in talk with Eswar Prasad on the Modi government's 1 year in office. You spoke of measures like financial inclusion, etc. as being game changers, but these are measures that will yield dividends only over the medium to long term. The question is, will the people wait so long? And is this where the political system in China gives that country an edge over India?
Now, it's important to recognize that although we see China as being a monolithic government, even in China, when Beijing dictates something, the provincial governments have very different incentives. So very often the reforms have to be structured in a way that the provincial governments also have the right incentives and can be brought on. And I think there is an interesting parallel in the context of India, which is being effectively applied. If you think about what the Modi government has done, at the national level, of course, it is trying to push forward with some reforms, but it is also giving the states some room to experiment. And indeed, even the previous government had used this strategy with some limited effectiveness. So for instance, on FDI in multi-brand retail, they gave states the room to experiment and try to encourage FDI in their own jurisdictions. And we've seen this being applied even by the Modi government, with, for instance, some labor market reforms being undertaken in Rajasthan. And I think this is one way of getting around political opposition, to give states the opportunity to move forward, to experiment with these reforms. And the hope is that if these states are successful with those reforms, then that demonstration effect the fact that the reforms can actually have benefits for the broader population, can help in building support in other states as well, and perhaps reduce opposition at the national level as well. But all of these big reforms you're talking about are certainly very difficult ones, and they cannot be accomplished overnight. But the key question is whether there is going to be a decisive start made, and that is going to take some serious political capital that the Modi government has to be willing to use, and I think it has a lot in reserve that it could be using. But starting on the right path, making a down payment on the reforms is really the key right now.
What are the immediate measures that you think the Modi government could take that would yield quicker results?
Well, I think many of the reforms that the government has been trying to push forward that have become stalled, as you noted, for political reasons, are the ones that need to be gotten through. The implementation of the goods and services tax, the GST, is an obvious issue here, because that is something that would increase the efficiency of the revenue system overall. And of course, a lot has to be sorted out even in terms of the GST, and the way it's been designed is far from perfect in terms of the number of exclusions from the GST system, issues about the amount of revenues that will be devolved back to the states. But having said all that, moving forward with the bulk of the reform is really crucial, because right now the tax system as it is structured is not helping in terms of efficiency, is creating a lot of distortions in the system, and is certainly not good for business and the movement of goods around state. Land reform also has gotten somewhat stalled, and again, if one looks at the precise measures that were proposed, one could see areas where there definitely could be improvement. But I think trying to make these legislations perfect can end up basically stalling reforms. So we really need to push through some of these reforms, even if they are not perfect at the moment. Building capital markets that can promote longer term investments, especially in infrastructure, is certainly another key priority where I think the government is going to have to put in some more effort. So I think the list of things that needs to be done is not really that complicated, but right now getting past this political hurdles and trying to push through the reforms that the government has already committed itself to, I think really is the key.
And if we are to look overseas, how would you assess India's performance vis-a-vis that of the other emerging economies?
So among the emerging markets, India certainly stands out as being much less vulnerable. Just about a year ago, India was considered one of the vulnerable five, the fragile five economies. And from that fragile five, India is the one country that looks a lot less fragile right now, because the current account deficit is down. So India is much less dependent on foreign capital. Inflation is down, and the growth momentum looks very positive. In virtually every other major emerging market economy, including China, which is still growing very fast, growth momentum has declined. So China seems to be facing declining growth. Brazil, South Africa are very vulnerable. Indonesia was doing well for a while, but in Indonesia, the new government faces much greater political constraints than the Modi government does. So among the emerging markets right now, India still stands out as something of a bright spot, because all the macroeconomic fundamentals seem to be in decent shape, and the economy has pretty good growth momentum. But there are still lots of wrinkles in this picture, because India might not be vulnerable on the external side, but still in terms of export performance, India has certainly not been doing that well. Plus, of course, the capital inflows over the last year or so do create some vulnerability if the US Federal Reserve were to tighten, and that should lead to some outflows of capital. I don't think this will cause a major policy complication for India, but it's certainly not assured that India is completely out of the woods in terms of having a stable macro environment and a good platform for strong growth. But it certainly looks a lot better than most other emerging markets.
Let me interrupt you for a moment, Eswar, because it's time for us to slip into another very short break, but please do stay with us. We'll be back very soon. Welcome back. You're watching Macros with Mythili, and we're discussing with the one and only Eswar Prasad on his view of the Modi government's performance, his outlook for the future, not only for India but for the world as well. Now let me shift to the US economy. Is it recovering or not? The signs are not very clear at all.
Well, sitting here in Washington, D.C. and Talking to policymakers in the US, they are as uncertain about exactly where the economy stands as you just mentioned, because every data point seems to add to the uncertainty rather than providing much clarification. By many indicators, the labor market continues to do very well. The unemployment rate is at or slightly below the level which a year ago the Federal Reserve had said would be consistent with a level of full employment. There is not zero unemployment rate, but an unemployment rate that is consistent with the economy having closed the output gap and being back at potential. But then the first quarter GDP growth numbers were very weak, perhaps partly due to some statistical and other special reasons, but we don't really know. But from the point of view of the Federal Reserve, the big issue, of course, is that despite the strength of the labor market, despite what is happening in the economy, wage and price pressures still remain very muted. So the inflation rate is still below the Fed's target, and there is no obvious sign of wage pressures. So it's a very delicate time for the US Federal Reserve, because they don't want to seem behind the curve by delaying interest rates too much. But my sense actually is that they are in a lucky position of being able to have it both ways. Because if the Fed were to raise the short-term policy rate, say around September, as many in markets seem to believe might happen, it's not obvious that the long-term interest rates, which ultimately affect economic activity, will rise. Why is that? It's partly because if the Fed was to raise short-term interest rates, I think we will have a lot of capital inflows from the rest of the world, partly for safe haven reasons and partly because of expectations that the yield curve is going to shift up. And that could keep long rates down. So the Fed might be able to have both ways, signaling that it is going to get ahead of the curve on inflation, but at the same time not having the yield curve result in a substantial slowdown in economic activity or economic momentum. The Fed is also very cognizant of the fact that any changes in its policy, unless it is very clearly communicated in advance, might create turmoil in markets around the world and especially hurt emerging markets. And what we've been hearing from Fed officials is that they are very sensitive to that risk and are going to do the best they can to communicate their intention well before they take any step. But the reality right now is that they don't know. And I've seen federal officials basically state this in public, that they don't quite know when they're going to move because the data are still not giving them a clear picture.
So what will it take for the US Fed to start raising interest rates? What kind of macro numbers are they really waiting for?
The Federal Reserve, I think, would like to see a clear indication of data moving in the same direction, with the economy continuing to generate something in the range of 200 to 250,000 net non-farm payroll jobs per month, the economy growing, that is GDP growth, getting back to the 2 or 2.5% range. But most importantly, it's only once they see tightening in the labor market, especially in terms of wages beginning to rise significantly, that I think they are likely to act. And so far we haven't seen that, because even though employment growth has been pretty good, a significant chunk of it has been part-time employment. And of course, the fact that the unemployment rate is now around 5.5% should not be seen as too positive, because since the financial crisis, that is over the last 7-8 years, the participation rate in the labor force, that is the number of people who are actually out looking for jobs or otherwise participating in the labor force for employment, relative to the total working age population, that has fallen by about 3 percentage points. So the unemployment rate is not giving us a good indicator of the employment rate, that is how many people out of the potential labor force are actually employed. But I think it's really a consistent sequence of data in the right direction in terms of economic strength, plus some indication that wage and price pressures are building up. That would force the Fed's hand. But so far we haven't seen data moving consistently in either direction.
How do you see the Chinese slowdown, and how is it going to impact the world economy and India in particular?
My sense is that China has enough space to be able to maintain growth in the range of 6.5 to 7% for the next couple of years, because they have a lot of room in terms of monetary policy and in terms of fiscal policy. The big question is how they're going to sustain growth. and that has implications for China and the rest of the world. Back in 2008, 2009, when the financial crisis hit, what the Chinese did was to create a huge amount of credit expansion. They basically told the banks, most of which are state-owned, to go out and lend, and the banks lent a very large amount, which fueled a very large investment boom, which is what kept the Chinese economy afloat and perhaps held the global economy as well during a very difficult time. The Chinese are very cognizant that if they go back to that old playbook that is generating a huge credit-financed investment binge, that is ultimately not going to be good for them, because that will create a lot of excess capacity in the industries that already have excess capacity, could feed into more deflationary pressures and non-performing loans in the banks, and then China would have no alternative but to export its way out of the problems it would have created for itself. So the Chinese policymakers, especially the central bank, the People's Bank of China, or PBOC, have been very, very cautious about this, and this is why we've seen very small and incremental reductions in the interest rate and in the reserve ratio in order to try and not generate such a broad credit expansion. But I think they are facing some fairly serious headwinds, with the equity market now being very frothy and potentially being subject to a substantial decline in values. The housing market, which was a big risk, seems to have stabilized somewhat. Prices are not falling that much anymore, and in some tier 2 cities at least, but how they pull through is really going to have serious ramifications for the Chinese economy and ultimately for the world at large. So from India's perspective, I think a Chinese economy that grows in a balanced and sustainable way, and that can start taking in more imports, especially of the sort of goods that India produces and is reasonably competitive at exporting, would be the right thing to hope for, rather than having China slow down, which I don't think is good for China or anybody in the region or the world economy.
What kind of a roadmap should we have in India for future reforms? Should we go in for big bang reform, or is incrementalism the only way to go?
I think big bang reforms in a complex economy like India, which is not by any means at the verge of a crisis, is going to be politically very unrealistic and potentially could set off its own uncontrollable consequences. So that's not what I advocate for India. But I think the reforms that they do have in mind, which again, we're all aware of exactly what needs to be done, pushing those through in a concerted form, and again, rather than trying to do things overnight, which certainly the Modi government has no intention of doing, but to make a down payment on these reforms to show very clearly what the end point is going to be, and that they're going to make a decisive start fairly soon. That, I think, is what the Indian economy needs in terms of building confidence, both among domestic investors and households and firms more broadly, but also among foreign investors. So there is no real magic bullet here. It's just a plodding process to put forward these reforms, but I think showing the political will to push forward these reforms methodically, rather than rolling them back or creating policy uncertainty, for instance, has been happening with the tax issues. I think that's the key. Policy uncertainty, forward momentum, and a down payment in terms of key reforms. That, I think, is what India needs right now, rather than big bang reforms.
Well, I'm afraid we've come to the end of our time, Eswar. It's been great talking to you. Thank you so much for joining us and sharing your views both in the Indian economy as well as the global economy.
My pleasure, Mythili.
Thank you also for watching. But we'll be back next week with yet another edition of Macros with Mythili. Till then, it's thank you and goodbye from all of us at ET Now.
Find us on Facebook at facebook.com/etnow, and don't forget to click the like button. You can also follow us on Twitter at etnowlive. To stay updated with all our programming, hit the subscribe button on our YouTube channel by logging on to youtube.com/user/etnow.